Hello and welcome to the Tinto Podcast. I'm Ted Intorcio, owner of Tinto Press, a publisher of independent comics with a focus on reality-based themes and an eye to good storytelling. You can find all of our books at tintopress.com. I have a topic in mind for today's podcast. With all the division and polarization in politics today and with the depressing news about the economy due to the pandemic and the unemployment, etc., I thought it would be good to discuss a subject we can all agree on. Something fun and completely without controversy or disagreement of any kind. That's right, I'm talking about religion. Religion in comics, to be exact. Here to discuss it with me are two of my favorite longtime friends and a new friend who I'm sure is going to become a favorite. First, author, publisher, comics historian, activist, and a devout atheist. The one and only Denis Kitchen. Hi, Denis.
Hey, Ted.
Next, author and probably best known cartoonist for Fante, Bukowski, and Blammo, and author of an upcoming book on Mormonism. We have Noah Van Sciver. Hi, Noah.
Hello.
And then finally, we have Father John Bagnall, a wonderful cartoonist, creator of Don't Tread on My Rosaries and Knitting with Coal Smoke, among others. And in his day job is an actual Roman Catholic priest. So, hi, Father John.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, John.
Oh, nice. I'm going to get your guys' lower thirds out of the way. So, Noah, we're going to start with you, but tell us about your new project. Are you recreating the Book of Mormon, and how are you tackling that?
No, I'm not recreating the Book of Mormon. I wrote how the Book of Mormon was, where it came from, the story of Joseph Smith. I'm just telling his life story.
Okay.
So basically, like how he claims he found the golden plates that were the Book of Mormon, how he formed his religion,
right,
and then how he was murdered.
And what are you using as a reference? I mean, I know you were raised Mormon, so you probably did you go to a Mormon school?
No, I did Sunday school like every kid, but I bought a whole bunch of biographies that I read and took notes from.
I see.
And there's Amy again. But yeah, just my own research basically. A lot of note taking. It's the same. I went through this whole process when I did my first book, the hypo about Lincoln.
I see.
So this time I just took on something that had a little bit more personal relevance to me.
Are you still practicing?
No, I'm not a member of the church anymore.
I see. And when did you leave?
I was pulled out of the church when my parents got divorced, so I was probably 13 when I was officially removed.
Ah.
So it's been a while.
Is that going to play into this book at all? Any of your personal experiences?
No, I did. I wrote like a foreword and an afterword that kind of delved into my own personal history with the church, but I don't think I'm actually going to include it anymore because I wrote that stuff early on in the process of putting the book together, and I felt like I started to feel like really insecure about it. Like nobody's going to want to just read this. Like I should try and include myself as a character somehow, and then it'll be more interesting. But as I've gone along on the book, I realized that the book is really strong on its own as just a story, and so I just cut that stuff out.
Interesting.
Yeah. And this is the book right here, by the way.
Oh, dang. I was going to ask how many pages it is, but if I know, let's see, the thickness of your board, I'd say it's
right.
about 200.
About 250 pages.
Yo.
250.
Hey, I'm sure it's going to be fascinating. I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, Noah
I've seen some pages on Facebook, Noah, that you posted on it. I'm really looking forward to the finished product. Is it going to be black and white?
No, it's in color.
Right. Yeah.
Are you coloring it yourself?
Right.
Yep.
And
coloring it and everything.
What you've kind of used a couple of different styles to color stuff. Like the stuff you did for Fante Bukowski is a really cool sort of. It's a multimedia look. I don't know do you do it all in Photoshop, or do you actually use colored pencils? Or
It's colored pencils and watercolors, and then I'll scan that in on a separate layer, do flat Photoshop colors.
Huh.
So that's a technique I use just because I don't like just the coldness of like a flat computer color. So I like to give it some kind of like actual texture and like real media on top of it.
Right.
So.
Well, what kind of what I was going to say, what sort of moved you to tackle this particular subject? Like, I don't think any of the other stuff you've done has dealt with religion at all.
Well, in an issue of Blammo number 9, honestly, like when I turned 30, I really started thinking about faith a lot more, and like if I started to kind of evaluate, like, am I being pulled to any faith? Like, do I have any like room in my life for that? Am I missing out on something that I should have been a part of, but because my mother kind of made that decision for me, like I wouldn't know or something. Like, I don't know. I just wanted to like investigate that. So in Blammo 9, I started talking more about my history in the church, which I didn't talk about because it's kind of it was like an embarrassing thing, and people look at you kind of weird when they find out that you have something to do with the LDS Church. I started there, and then I got really fascinated by it, and I wanted to investigate what the church was all about, because even as a member, I didn't really know what it was all about, besides the kind of like romantic story that they tell you. So yeah, I just wanted to investigate it, but the best way for me to learn is to learn through my art. So I just took it on. It's like I'll draw it because if I'm like drawing the story, that I'm kind of living it, because I have to like inhabit that time period and stuff through my art. So I don't know. Yeah, kind of a garbled way of explaining it all, but
will the deluxe edition come with golden spectacles, Noah?
It's up. I don't know. We'll see.
I don't know what that reference what's that referring to?
Oh,
it's when he got the plates, there were some spectacles as well to help him translate it. But that doesn't really make sense, because because they say that, but then they also say that he used his seer stone to translate them.
Right.
So it's multiple, and then sometimes they say that there was like a breastplate and a sword also in there, but you don't see any of that in their artwork, that the church's own like paintings and stuff.
Is there a lot of Noah? Is there a lot of disagreement about the Joseph Smith story? Do people claim different versions of it?
Not within the church. They all kind of stick to the same version. Yeah. But outside of it, the people that are ex-Mormons are all kind of like, yeah, what the heck is this about? Like, this isn't how they portrayed it and stuff. So like, if you see the church's like official paintings of the book being translated, a lot of it is like just Joseph like at a table with these golden plates out, and he's just sitting there with his finger on them, like reading them to like his friend who's writing them, because he was illiterate, he couldn't really write, so he always had a scribe working with him. But
is it right that the plates were lost?
They weren't lost. He had to return them back to the angel after he was done translating the book. So that's the whole thing. Like, he always had a scribe with him who, like, he would just put the stone in the hat and put his head in the hat and read out what the stone was showing, because the stone was showing him what would be written on these plates. But the plates were in a box on the desk, or sometimes just covered with a handkerchief or a cloth. And he would just be sitting with his head in the hat next to them, reading. The stone said while his friend wrote it down. So it was like automatic writing. And at the end of that process, the angel said, like, we'll choose three witnesses to come with you, and like, and then we'll show these witnesses the plates. So those were like his 3 friends who like became the people who helped him organize the church early on. And then eventually they all left. They all left the church. They all gave up on it. So,
is this what's your purpose in doing this? I mean, how are you attacking it with, like, with extreme reverence or as a historical sort of document, or are you making a comment on the Mormon Church, or what's going on with your?
I'm not making any comment. I'm just like doing it totally straightforward. I don't even use narration or captions. It's just written just like a graphic novel. Just all the exposition and stuff is told through dialogue. It's just like you're watching a movie or just reading a graphic novel about something, but like it's up for the reader to decide what they think. I'm just reading what I can find out and then translating that stuff into a comic. So.
And like, is it that, like what's the main point of the book in terms of, is there a recognizable story in it? And how would you describe that story?
The story to me is a man coming from nowhere, gaining a lot of power, and then that power going to his head. That's what the story is to me. A lot of people in the church, I'm sure they would disagree with that and be insulted by it. But when you just look at the story of his life plainly, that's what it is. He finds a way to get all this power, and then what does he do? He like starts sleeping with everybody's wife. Him and his friends like organize a bank, and all the church members like put all their life savings into it, and they take all their life savings and buy a bunch of land with it for their own. Like it was just like, I don't know. It just seems like a very common story to me.
Right.
And the downfall of that,
Oh, that's interesting. It's that I think the Bible is rife with those stories.
Yeah.
David, and the Old Testament probably more so, but I don't know. Dennis, what's your take on that?
On Mormonism?
Meh. On the story, on the yeah, sure.
Well, I've been fascinated with the Mormon Church. I'm fascinated with religion in general, and especially the fact that it's one of the more recent inventions, and clearly to me invented by a guy who was essentially a con artist, I think. But the fact that it's also one of the religions that's new enough you can actually disprove it, because my understanding is he claimed the Indians were the lost tribe of Israel, right? And you can prove through DNA now that there's absolutely no connection between Jews and American Indians. So it's a provably false premise. And aside from that, I just am curious of how it grew and how it today is in such a powerful position, especially in the state of Utah. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I have to say, I was deeply impressed with Mitt Romney during the impeachment trial, who seemed to be the only guy on his side of the aisle who actually had integrity, and he is someone whose religion is very dear to him, and it affects his integrity in a way that I found admirable. So I can't say I look at the church with a completely dark view. I just am fascinated by its evolution.
John, what's your take on it?
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting, as Dennis says, that it's a more recent religion. So, you can chart its development and how it grew to be so big. But growing up in England in the 70s, Mormonism for us meant the Osmonds. And but also, and the Osmonds were really big, especially Donnie and Marie when I was at school. So that was my first exposure to Mormonism, and it seemed to have this kind of squeaky clean image. And I do remember also, I don't know whether they'd be called missionaries, but when the traveling around in pairs, I do remember them calling it the house. So that was my only really exposure to Mormonism and the church. But I mean, there are Latter-day Saint church buildings dotted around the UK, so they obviously do have the church does have a following here in the UK as well. I didn't know much about the Joseph Smith story, And it was probably just seeing little excerpts on Facebook of Noah showing a few pages as he was drawing them that made me kind of look online and try to find out a bit more about Joseph Smith. And I just had a really vague, loose understanding of how it was all founded. But it seems to be a fascinating story, and well worth recording in a graphic novel. And I quite like the way, Noah, you seem to be doing it in a very straight way and not kind of making any editorial comment or opinion. You're not trying to force your opinion on it. It's just you're just presenting the material.
Well, one thing I've learned as I've been working on it, and I'm I've been noticing since we've been having this conversation, these thoughts, like talking about this stuff, is still so new to me that I'm having trouble like articulating correctly, like my feelings about working on this book. But one of the things that's come across to me while working on it is that no matter what I do, no matter what I write in this book, for believers, they'll see it one way, and for people who don't believe it, they're going to see it the other way.
Sure.
So like everything I do, it's like nothing is like, so like when this book comes out, there will be articles that say like, see, this book proves that this is full of crap. But then there will be articles that say, see, this book proves that this is the truth or whatever, Yeah. Because that's just how interesting like his story was. Like,
in terms of religion,
I was wondering, within the Church of the Latter-day Saints, whether, for example, as there are in the Catholic Church and say in Judaism as well, whether there are sort of liberal Mormons and conservative or traditional Mormons who might, some of the if there are any liberal Mormons, they might view your book in a favorable light.
Is there such a thing, Noah?
There is.
I don't know.
My parents were liberal Mormons, so.
But very about, right?
It's like a Jesus freak, My parents were very hippie-ish when I was growing up, but then we all went to church. Like my father had really long hair, and one of the stories of my family was that one time our bishop brought him into the office and was like, Harvey, there's just one way. There's a certain look that a man of God should have. And my dad pointed to the picture of Jesus behind him and said, like that?
And you actually addressed a little bit of that in One Dirty Tree, right? Yeah, which was a great book.
That's like a classic story for us.
I could see those two as being bundled together, actually, like the new book and One Dirty Tree. But maybe you don't feel that way. I don't know.
I don't know. We'll see how when it's all finished. Try and read one.
Is it done? Is the black and white art done?
No, I probably have about 2 more chapters to draw, so we'll see. I mean, right now I'm like kind of at the very beginning of writing about his like celestial marriages, where he says that God, in order to like bring the church back to the most perfect. I can't. My words are escaping me. Like the most, like God. Like, so basically, the Mormon Church was supposed to be like a reformation of God's original will for a church for him. That men should marry other wives, because in the Bible, in the Old Testament, I think, or something, like some of the people, like it kind of casually mentions that so and so had like multiple wives. And then it's just like, now see, that proves that like that this is how it's supposed to be. Like they're not like looking down on him for doing that.
Yeah, they had slaves too, and that seemed to be condoned.
Yeah,
sure.
That's mentioned about the lost tribes of Israel. Do you know there's a movement in the UK with not many members who claim that the lost tribe of Israel were British?
Britons. Wow, I did not know that. That's.
I think they go around trying to argue their point.
Well, I don't think we can get through this conversation without somebody. It might as well be me mentioning R. Crumb's Book of Genesis Illustrated, which I don't know about the people watching, but this certainly had a huge effect on me in terms of what a graphic novel can be. and the straight nature in which R. Crumb interpreted the first book of the Old Testament. Was this a huge influence on you, Noah? I mean, it was definitely on me, but.
Oh, I mean, I like that book a lot, but it's not connected to what I'm working on. There's a lot of differences. I mean, this is not illustrating the Book of Mormon or anything. This is just the story of. This would be like, if R. Crumb had done the history of the Bible instead, like how the Bible was written.
Right.
Kind of like that. This is the page, by the way, where he is talking to one of the witnesses named Oliver Cowdery about how he's gotten this kind of revelation about having multiple wives, and it's like in Genesis 4, in the lineage of Cain, it said that Lamech, his descendant, took for himself 2 wives. So this was like something that Joseph Smith read or heard about and decided, like, that's what we have to do. Like, we should be taking wives like that, I mean, that's the way he explained it, but then it's like he just started taking way too many wives, and and it's like before that, like, people were already a little concerned about him. Like, there were already rumors going around about Joseph getting fresh with some of the ladies in his church. So when he said that to his friend Oliver, what's that?
Well, I'm just saying it happens again and again throughout most faiths, most religions.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's always thus, as Mr. Natural said, right?
Yeah.
It's always thus.
Ted, did you know I agented the Genesis book? That was originally going to be a kitchen sink book.
I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah.
It was just going to be Adam and Eve, wasn't it?
No, it was going to be the book of Genesis always. Not that Crumb is religious, but he just thought it was a weird, fascinating story, and he wanted to tell it literally. And he took great pains to work with a biblical scholar because he didn't want to he didn't want to interpret anything himself. He wanted to make sure he was on a solid historical ground. So he took it very seriously, though he's not religious, didn't believe in it, still wanted to portray it right.
But there's a similar thing there between me and him, because he grew up Catholic, and then later on you always find yourself having to deal with that at a certain point in your life. If you have any kind of religion in your past, it's going to come back.
I was going to mention Justin Green and the Pinky Brown. I mean, that's a classic example of someone revisiting their youth and how religion, damaged them.
Yeah.
In comic book form.
Yep.
It's that's another ongoing theme, I think. As a sort of non-practicing Catholic myself, it's interesting to see like another person's perspective on what, for instance, the book of Genesis looks like, in a completely straight manner. Like I loved it. I loved the book, and it didn't really affect any of my faith one way or the other. As I looked at much of the Old Testament as sort of very much about storytelling. And
what did you think, John? Did you like it?
I think the Genesis book has some of his best drawing, but I do prefer Crumb when he's being himself, when he puts himself into his strips. And it is very literal. It's a really literal interpretation of, the book of Genesis is very, it's full of myths. I don't mean myths in that they're not true, in that they have meaning, but, that he's interpreted them in a very kind of solid, literal sense, which is fine. But I don't think this is one of his best books.
So you're
he leaves quite a lot of himself out of it, and I think Crumb is at his best when he's really sort of
being himself,
professional, and when he's just unrestrained and doing work about himself.
But you're Catholic, right?
Yeah.
He's a Roman Catholic priest, actually. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So nothing in Crumb's Genesis bothered you? You didn't take issue with anything in there?
No, in a way, because I think that no, I think as I say, he interpreted it in a very literal way. The creation story. As I said, it's got some good drawing, but for me, it's not the crumb that I enjoy reading.
But in your faith, do you take those stories literally, like they literally happened, or do you think that they're
No, because
okay.
I think you find in sort of evangelical Christians, they would believe that those stories were literally happened. Like the world being created in 7 days. But I mean, you only need to kind of dip into a bit of scholarship to see that those creation myth stories exist in other faiths, and they're very similar. And in Judaism, religious Jews would tell you that they don't take it literally either. They understand that stories can tell a truth. For example, that we believe that God somehow shapes the world and is a creator, but it wouldn't happen in 7 days. It's just using the language of stories, which is right throughout, especially in the Old Testament. Stories are used to tell a truth, but they're not things which probably literally happened. I mean, certainly in the creation story, no one really believes now, except for fundamentalist Protestant Christians. And I'm not kind of being divisive there, but there are Christians who would take every word of the Bible as literally true, and I think that's quite a dangerous interpretation of language, because language is so much more subtle than that. And throughout history, stories have been one of the best ways of conveying truths, expressed.
I agree with you. So where would you draw the line between what's to be taken literally in the Bible and what's not? To me, how can you ever determine?
Well, I think a Jew wouldn't dispute that they believe that they are the
chosen people.
Chosen people, yeah, and that they have a special relationship with God. Especially in those the early days of the stories which come across in the Old Testament.
Why would God have special people? Why wouldn't all of His creation be equal?
Well, that's why Christians believe that Christianity is based on Judaism, because it has a connection with Judaism, because of course Jesus was a Jew. It was then that the faith went out to everyone and to the whole world, and it took another prophet like Jesus to do that, to initiate that, and for other people to carry on that work of a faith that would be Catholic. Catholic means universal, so it's for all races, all colours, all peoples. For Jews, the story really ends. It really hasn't happened yet, because they don't believe that the Messiah has come. Mm-hmm. They still believe that a Messiah will come.
Here.
Yeah. But they don't think Jesus was the right one.
There periodically are rabbis dying in Brooklyn that they thought were immortal, but they keep dying.
Yeah.
See, for me, at least, I know Joseph Smith is an actual historical figure. To me, I'm not convinced Jesus was a historical figure. There's no evidence of his existence. It's simply faith.
Really?
Yeah. There's no historical evidence. No.
There is evidence. There's evidence in writings of the time.
Nothing contemporaneous. Absolutely. And there are others.
There's just someone called Josephus who recorded about Jesus Christ.
Makes a reference. There were numerous, as I understand it, historical figures referred to as Christ. There's no individual that we know was crucified, etc. It's simply not recorded. So it's all recorded, much later. So it's an oral tradition.
It's an oral tradition up until, well, not for very long.
Well, the writings, as you know, from the first couple of centuries are virtually non-existent. And I mean, even your first pope, you know almost nothing about. That it's so long ago. There's almost no what we would call empirical evidence for any of it.
Well, there's an interesting, story about was it Marco Polo, which everybody thought was a historical figure for the longest time, but apparently there's very, very little actual historical evidence that there was a guy named Marco Polo that went to the Far East, and then came back to Italy, and whether or not there's historical evidence for Jesus or not, I don't know that that to the people that have the faith, so to speak, whether they're convinced anyway, and I guess that's the bottom line for them.
No, I understand, and faith is always portrayed as a positive thing. To me, it's believing in a superstition, and I will never understand that. That's
I personally like to liken religion and God in terms of sort of a plumbing metaphor. It's like God is maybe and this is maybe I'm speaking in a broad sense here, but to people of faith, the water that goes through the plumbing is God, right? And the plumbing is the religion that brings it to the people, I suppose. And much like real plumbing, it can be broken. It can, after a certain amount of time, after a long time, it starts to break, and you have to have it repaired, and it has to be upkept. And there's something about that. So, plumbing can poison people, as it did in Michigan. And so, yeah, I think I tend to try to draw a distinction between faith and religion, but I also don't want to try to tell people how to live, I guess, how they want to. I think people can gain a lot of good things from religion, but they can also gain a lot of bad things.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, when we mentioned earlier on about how things can go wrong in different faiths and, through lots, whatever faith, and they go wrong again and again. And that's because we're all, fallible human beings, and we can be easily corrupted and, tempted by, whatever. And there have been some real scandals in the Catholic Church, for example, with, clerical abuse. So things go wrong because it's terrible. But these things happen again because we're human beings, and religion can also be used for bad ends as well. That happens as well, and for control of people as well. I mean that happens again and again as well, but hopefully not so much these days.
But John, why would you want to be a member of something that's been so thoroughly corrupt for centuries and centuries? What some of the popes did, what things that have been done in the name of the church, from the Inquisition on to child abuse that's current right now. Why do you want to be a member of that club? I don't get it.
Really, because I think you have to distinguish between in the human side of things and going back to Jesus and what his teaching means. And the reason why I'm a Christian is because I believe that Jesus's teaching is profoundly it's something that is certainly worth following.
But why can't you separate that from the corrupt institution that seems
I don't believe that the church is entirely corrupt. I think that there are human institutions tend to be imperfect. Well, they are. They're all imperfect. And I think you do have to distinguish between religion and institutional religion and personal faith. I mean, I see lots of good examples, with my parishioners of people who are, quietly selfless, do lots of work for other people, and they're not wanting any credit for it, and I think that. So I think that all those unpublicized examples are where faith is a good force, a force for good.
I think one of the arguments about religion can be, and in some cases there's a lot of true, is that, and I don't hold you in this regard at all, John, and that is that religion can be very close-minded. It's my way or the highway, and I do see that in a lot of religious institutions. I've seen that in the Catholic Church. I've seen that in my own education and everything. But I will say, in defense of that I was one of those guys that learned to think, for myself. I make my own decisions, and if the church is saying, for instance, you can't use condoms, I'm going to look at that and kind of say, well, okay, thanks for that advice, and then I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and try to lead a life that. But I don't think that that's something that you're going to get excommunicated for, let's say. I actually started reading this book not too long ago, and I think it's relevant. It's called Being Catholic Now by Carrie Kennedy. Have you ever read that?
No.
Either of you? It's an interesting book because this is a very devout Catholic woman who's from the, her father was Robert F. Kennedy. Was it?
Okay.
And it was she grew up very devout and everything, but she has a lot of problems with certain things. But she's still a believer and still a devout church-going woman. And I think that there's I don't want to play the peacemaker in this.
Well, you mentioned before about the church telling you to do something.
Right.
Well, there is this church teaching, but the church also says, well, more than anything, that your conscience comes first.
That's
because
something I learned.
We are blessed with reason. We all have reason. Human beings have reason, and the conscience as well. So we can, as long as we can look at things in an intelligent way, and say, well, the church says this. Do I agree with it? Because you can't just accept things because you're told to do something. Maybe you can do that when you're a child,
right? Not
when you're an adult, and your conscience is formed and your intelligence has developed, and you know how to use reason.
But I don't.
So I think it's
a widely accepted understanding in religion.
So John, if a good person like Ted, and let's assume he is a good person,
that's big. I don't know.
He blithely ignores most of what the church tells him to do.
It's several
and
things.
Is he still going to go to heaven, or is he going to go to hell, or is he going to go to purgatory? What happens at poor Ted?
And the same thing applies to, say, someone who's a Muslim. If you read the documents, I'm not saying that you should, but if you read, say, the theology of Vatican II, in the 60s, there's the understanding that if you're trying to live a good life, and you are charitable and kind, and you don't hurt people, then in a sense you are a person who has faith in God, because you believe in those values, and but so it says that
you're tying being a good person to God. Well, I would argue, and any ethical humanist, secular humanist would argue, you can lead a completely ethical and good life with nothing to do with God. And I don't expect to go to heaven or hell. But to say someone is good because of God, to me, I reject that argument out of hand. I don't see a connection. I think coincidentally, you can be a good person and believe in God.
Which you are, Dennis, and I've seen it, Can I just tell this really quick story? I don't want to get too far off the subject, but I was a couple of years ago, Dennis came to Dink, and we were hanging out in Boulder. And there was a homeless man, and I was walking past the guy, and Dennis gave him some money, and the guy said, "God bless you," and Dennis said, "God's got nothing to do with it."
So give my money back.
and almost got into an argument with the guy. But I thought that was a great example of, where a person can be, perfectly secular. I don't know. I think the difference is one of interpretation. How Father John here interprets. I don't want to speak for you either.
Thinking about heaven as being a place. Well, if you do read, if you read the Gospels, Jesus talks about eternal life being now. So if you are, living a good life, and for example, if you're trying to follow the teaching of Jesus, then that is in a sense heaven. Heaven is not really a place, and it's again and again in the Gospels about eternal life being a kind of an eternal now, because you're already living in that mindset.
I'd love to bring the conversation.
And why did the church invent a thing called purgatory?
Probably because people were so worried about this. There were these people imagining that there was something called limbo, and that came out of nowhere. So,
right, for like babies who died, for example.
Yeah, about that. If babies died without being baptized, some theory developed that said that they would go to limbo, which would be a place, a kind of a non-place, not unpleasant, but and so because we believe that God is all good and all loving, that's why the idea of purgatory developed as a kind of a purification.
Well,
if I could bring the conversation back to religion in comics really quickly. Right. Dennis, did you have any involvement with R. Crumb as he was creating the Genesis? You said it was going to be a book. Did you have conversations with him about it and everything?
Well, I was happy to publish it. We had a discussion about it around 1996 or 7. And shortly after that, my company started to go into a tailspin, so I was unable to publish it, and so he never started it. I just assumed that he would do it for someone else, but he didn't. So some years passed, and I was having a conversation with a New York publisher who had been a big fan of Crumb's, and he said, "What's he up to these days?" He said, "I'd love to publish something by him." So I just threw out, I said, he always wanted to do the book of Genesis. And he said, "I'd publish that in a minute." So I went back, I called Crumb in France, and I said, "Did you ever do anything with that?" And he said, "Nah." I said, "Would you still like to?" And he said, "Well, it'd probably take me a full year to draw. I'd have to have a significant advance." So he threw out a number he would need, and I said, "So if I can get you that, you'll do it?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "You got to promise me, because my word will look, bad if you ultimately back out." So no, he said he would. So I got him twice the amount he wanted.
Wow.
But it took him twice as long as he thought to draw. I was not involved at all in the process, other than I would see things in advance, and I got to see some of the in jokes that he put in it. For example, if you have to look carefully, but when he would have all of these panels where, Jehoshaphat begat his son and all these begats, there's a lot of different faces, and he drew people in the village who had beards and who looked like they could be plausible, and he ran out of them. And finally, if you look carefully, the Three Stooges.
I think I know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I had that page, actually. But I thought the garb and everything, he must have spent a lot of time working on the costuming and everything. Because
he tried, and he was having difficulty finding real source material for what people wore and what the ox carts look like and all of this. So Pete Poplaski is his neighbor. He's another old underground cartoonist and friend. And Pete is a big movie buff. So he took, like, Cecil B. DeMille's The Bible.
I was going to ask about that.
He took still frames from that and gave them to Robert. So a lot of the references are really Hollywood references.
The Ten Commandments?
Probably.
Yeah.
And the reason he did was they're plausible to the reader. They may not be archaeologically perfect, but they're plausible.
Right.
Something kind of similar with the Joseph Smith book that I'm working on. I took a lot of like Mormon media, like a lot of their own films and things, and I screenshot a lot of that stuff, a lot of the well-known films that they would have watched, a lot of the paintings, and I just basically cannibalized a lot of that material from my own book, so that if a member of the church was reading this book, they would kind of subconsciously recognize something in it.
Sure, that's smart.
So there's a lot of that kind of stuff in my book.
Is there any explanation for certain things in Mormonism that people hold as like for instance the garments and stuff? Do you talk about that in the book at all? Or
I don't think that was a part of Joseph Smith's era, because Joseph, after he was murdered, the church was taken up by Brigham Young.
Right.
He took it to Utah, and it kind of formed into what we now recognize. This is like early Mormon stuff. One thing that happens in Joseph Smith's era is the word of wisdom, which is why Mormons can't drink coffee or like tea or caffeine, smoke cigarettes or any of that stuff, no booze.
No fun of any kind.
No, and a lot of that was because Joseph and his buddies, they would be up all night smoking pipes and drinking and spitting tobacco and stuff, and then his wife Emma would have to clean it up in the morning. So she was getting so mad about him. She's like, can't we do something about this? So he had a revelation from God called the Word of Wisdom, which outlawed all of those things.
Oh.
And that's where that came from.
Yeah.
Is that the book?
Yeah,
That was probably one of the... Go on.
It took until sometime, correct me if I'm wrong, in the 1960s or later, before the church leaders decided that black church members could ascend to heaven.
Yeah, that was in the 70s. Yeah, it took a long time to do that.
And there's still like I was in at Sundance a couple of months ago in Salt Lake and the surrounding area, and I was like, boy, I could really go for a coffee. And I tell you, it was not easy to find now compared to today, like I expect as soon as I walk out the house for somebody to hand me a Starbucks cup. And there it was, I was like, hey, where's the local coffee shop? And I was in a comic store actually, and the guy said, this isn't a very caffeine-friendly neighborhood. It's like, okay. And then I went to a bar later that night actually, and they said that just recently, like really recently, like within the last 12 months, they opened up bars where you didn't have to have some kind of a membership in order to drink there, which I thought was interesting.
My mother went to Brigham Young University. That's where my parents met. Was at that university, and she was an art student there, and a lot of the students would have to have like a secret get together to have like nude models, because on campus they would be fully clothed models that they'd have to draw from life. So there'd be like a little secret meetup in somebody's apartment or whatever, where there'd be a nude model for them to actually work from.
This has been a fascinating conversation, and I gotta tell you, I'd like to do it again. I think there's so much more stuff to talk about. I don't know how you guys feel about it, and I won't ask right now. But
it might be, we could maybe talk about some of the other.
I would love to. I wanted to talk
like Chester
about Mouth, for instance, and the influence of Judaism in that story, and there's so many more that we didn't really hit on.
Yeah, actually, can I ask Noah quickly? What did you think of Michael Allred's Golden Plates comics?
I like his art a lot. I didn't like that comic. I thought it was really reverential. He's a member of the church.
I know.
So I
love his art too. I was kind of sad to see his use the talent for kind of propaganda purposes.
Yeah, I didn't like it. And in my book, any time that I've had to illustrate a scene from the Book of Mormon, I just did it in silhouettes. So it's just basically Joseph Smith speaking, telling these stories that are in this book, with silhouettes behind him that are acting out the action. Because I just didn't want to go that route. I just didn't. I feel bad because I like Michael Allred, but I didn't care for that series.
Okay.
Well, you know, and one of the things we didn't get to talk about is John's Father John's own comics, which are actually pretty secular.
Please. Well, let's talk about them.
Well, we're kind of running out of time here, and
if we're going to do this again with the same trio, I'd like to read them. I'm
Let's
confess I
do
haven't
that.
read your work, John. So
I will mail out some copies to you guys so that John doesn't have to pay for an international shipping. But and also you sent me some strips.
Yes, yeah.
And I will send those as well.
Right. Yeah. They're recent ones. I think probably now religion's just a kind of a background to my stories. You know, in the way that maybe it is in Catcher. I think it's more like a cultural setting. But you know, the Rosaries book does have two long stories, which definitely have a Catholic aspect to them.
Yeah, but I think they're very unassuming and non. What's the word? You're not thumping on any Bibles in these stories.
Oh no, and they are meant to be funny as well.
They're they were what drew me to contact you in the first place.
To be fair, Catholics aren't generally referred to as Bible thumpers.
That's true.
That's the evangelical crowd. Catholics are a lot milder in there.
I'd like you to meet my sister, Dennis.
Yeah, right?
You need to meet my sister.
Yeah.
And you change your mind, maybe.
Okay.
Very devout, very devout.
All right.
But that said, I want to thank you guys for this. I'm going to call this part one of this because I really find this stuff interesting, and I appreciate everybody's candor. And thank you guys for showing up. Hang out real quick. I'm just going to say quickly, you can check out Tinto Press at tintopress.com. We just finished a Kickstarter successfully, and there are links in there to check out the new books. So